A warm welcome back to the Information Security Stack together with me, Daniel Gustafsson and Kim Hindart.
Hubba.
So, on popular demand, we will talk about GDPR again. Because that is apparently what people want us to talk about again. So, let's talk about GDPR again. And a bit of a summary, because honestly, it was quite a while back since we did talk about this. So a little bit of summary where we are and what the popular questions are these days. And have we actually moved on that much since the introduction of GDPR in 2018? In 2022 early, almost 3.5 years later. Have we moved past Section 4 of GDPR just yet? Definitions.
No, we're still arguing over definitions in GDPR. And that's something, but yeah, as I try to say to people, I think GDPR is the very, very best law that's ever been written and approved. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the very, very worst law that's ever been written and approved at the same time. So how do you handle this bipolar condition? Other than being crazy in the head?
Well, I think that's the magic question right now that people is trying to figure out, to be honest with you.
Because I totally agree that there are a lot of stuff, a huge amount of stuff in the GDPR is up for interpretation and really not clear in any case how you're supposed to handle it. And this is a big issue. Because now people are trying and inventing their own handling and their own sort of without consulting experts in the area. And yeah, of course you get a lot of crazy interpretations. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there is a huge lobby mechanism. Let's say a hypothetical company, call it Muffins, that have some non-European interests in mind, want to do some lobbying and push a lot of money in blurring what should be really clear with a lot of propaganda. Mm-hmm. Then of course it will be blurred. And especially if the clear parts of GDPR is not what you want to hear. Yeah, of course you're hoping that the blurred message will be the one let's get through. So it's just watch the American news outlets today. Truth is not something that's an absolute anymore.
No, that has unfortunately been... I mean, unfortunately, that is true in most media today, that you push an agenda, right? And you try to push your agenda. And whatever the truth might be, depending on which side you stand on that truth, you push a different agenda. And that's where we stand currently. And unfortunately, that seems to be true also in this case, in terms of providers and service providers and cloud vendors and so on, that wants to tailor GDPR regulations to their specific needs rather than the opposite.
The fortunate part is, of course, that there are more and more court rulings regarding GDPR. And EDPB is coming out with a lot more direct provisions, direct rulings as well. The sad part is that why did you not come out with this when you implemented the law? A certification mechanism and a clarification mechanism should be in place before you take the law, not after the law. But yeah, you can always argue this because in no way was it really clear. But let's go back to basic. A few of the basic principles with GDPR. Daniel Gustafsson, you are an individual.
I am.
You want to purchase something on, let's say, a hypothetical big online marketplace. Call it Bamazon.
Yep, I want to buy a frying pan from Bamazon.
Exactly. Then, of course, Bamazon, wants to have some information from you
Mm-hmm.
in order to take payment from you.
Yep.
And deliver the frying pan to
Yep.
your home.
Of course.
And then we've discussed this. When they ask for your name and you say Daniel Gustafsson, that's not a personal data, because personal data needs to be able to directly or indirectly lead to one single living individual.
Yep.
On my end, when I say Kim Hindart as my name, then that's personal data.
And the difference is?
There's only one single individual named Kim Hindart in the world. There's several.
As we stand,
named.
there's only one Kim Hindart in the world. Thankfully for the rest of us, but there's only one Kim Hindart in the world. Daniel Gustafsson, there are several of us.
Yes.
Mm.
So you cannot, from a technical point, say this column in a database is personal data and this is not. No, that's not true.
Nope.
It's totally up to, can you relate to a single living individual?
Yep.
My IP address can be personal data and it cannot be at the same time.
Mm.
This makes it tricky, and I understand, but this is the part. Collect stuff about a single individual and you're into personal data.
Mm.
If you collect user behavior on your site, how fast you type, where you type, how you move your mouse, that will quickly add up to becoming personal data.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can then in the next turn identify a single individual from that.
Mm.
It doesn't require you to actually be able to identify a single individual. It's just that you can use it for the purpose of relating that to a single individual. So then, these are tricky parts. And then it's clearly that we tend to forget the basic principle of GDPR. Collecting any data that's a personal data from a data subject. So you, Daniel Gustafsson, data subject, each and every individual that participate in some type of online service, because let's be clear, let's skip the other rant cases where you have a written documentation somewhere. Let's talk about the most online services. But any data that can relate to a single living individual is personal data. And for you to be allowed to process that data, guess what? In the basic default scenario, it's illegal, it's prohibited to process any type of personal data. You're not allowed to process any type of personal data at all unless you meet all the 99 articles in the GDPR.
Yep.
And I mean, you really need to meet all the 99 articles in GDPR. You can't say, I meet 97 of them. That's good enough. Give me an A+. Now, unfortunately,
A for effort.
The law doesn't work that way.
No.
On a social science test or on a on a university test, yeah, absolutely. If you have 97 out of 99, that's an awesome score.
Yeah, that would score you an A for sure. Absolutely, yeah.
But in the law, no, unfortunately. I try to compare this to if you run across the speed limit. I bet you that the traffic provisions, the traffic laws in your country have a lot more laws than just speeding.
Yep. It's a law.
Even if you speed and get caught and they say you were speeding here, you can't say, but heck, I have a fully registered and security approved car and I wasn't drunk while driving it and I had my seatbelt on while driving it. So I filled all the other provisions in the traffic law.
Yeah.
Then of course I should be perfectly fine by speeding. Sorry. No. You broke the speeding law anyway. So
exactly.
You broke it.
It won't give you exactly. They will not give you a pat on the back and say, oh well, that's of course. We'll forget about the speeding ticket then. It doesn't work that way.
So we have still a lot of general principles discussing when we have this, but of course, this is when I mean that GDPR is a bad law also, because it's 99 articles that are highly advanced. Some of them are really questionable, and some are really hard to understand.
They are, and and here's the problem with GDPR as is. They have opened up for interpretation in some parts of the law. They haven't been clear enough in some parts of it, and that has given the opportunity for interpretation. And that's when you go south really fast.
Yes. And let's now be clear anyway with the parts that are clear, and that's the definition parts.
Yes.
And for some crazy strange point, we are discussing and debating definitions. No, sorry. There's no debating a definition. That's a definition.
Well, the definition didn't suit my needs. Hence, I want to debate and create a new one.
Yeah, but sorry, this is GDPR's definition of stuff, and GDPR is the law, so... Yeah, whatever definition you might have of a word outside GDPR.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes in terms of GDPR, it's the definition written in GDPR that's the point. So, So, personal data and data subject, that's something we've discussed right now. But yeah, anything that can relate to a single individual, an identifiable natural person, it's personal data. Okay. Collecting and by any means of operation, and this means any type of operation, recording, structuring, storage, retrieval, use, transmission or anything other, transmission, redaction, destruction. This is called processing. And GDPR is always pointed at corporate entities and organizations. So it's not for civilian persons, so to speak. It's company or legal entities that are a corporation or an organization. Yeah? Okay. So this legal entity that collects the data, that's actually responsible for saying, please, Daniel Gustafsson, I want your information that might be personal data. This legal entity is called the controller.
Yes.
Controller is also processing data. Then we have subcontractors to a controller that's called processors. And this causes confusion to no end.
Yeah, unbelievably.
But sorry, both the controller and processor are processing personal data.
Yes.
There's always a controller. There's no need for any processors at all.
No.
But of course, let's say that the company, that the store that wants to get your information for you to buy a frying pan is not the same legal entity as the entity that runs the servers, provides the hardware, provides the compute basics. For instance, it might be a cloud provider underneath the store. So from Amazon, there might be a BWS.
Yeah, there might be something underneath. I mean, again, almost every service today online is hosted somewhere else. Literally, no one is hosting their own service anymore. It's regardless if it's one of the major hyperscalers or if it's a local cloud provider or a local infrastructure provider of some sort. There most probably is not hosted in the basement of the company that owns the service.
So you have the controller. That's the one who's actually interacting directly with the data subjects. So those are the ones who want, for instance, the address up information from you in order to send you your frying pan. And guess what? Daniel Gustafsson at your home address. That's personal data.
Yep.
Because that uniquely identifies you.
Yeah, it's only one. It's only one here. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And with that said, I totally disagree. I thought you should have named your sons Daniel Gustafsson.
Well, I wanted to, but my wife said no. So let's continue.
Yeah, exactly. But now, guess what? Then, if you collect this, if you are the one responsible for wanting to collect this and host everything in your basement, have no subcontractors involved in the processing of data, then you don't need a processor. But otherwise, you will most probably today, absolutely most probably today, have a processor. That's another legal entity. The controller and the processors are always separate legal entities. And the processor is always a supplier to the controller. And as a supplier, you might of course be you might be so basic that you are responsible only for destroying disks. You're still part of the processing, because destruction of data is still a part of processing.
It's part of the lifecycle management of the data,
So you can be very much involved or very little involved. But you are still a processor. You still need to have a contract with clear instructions from the controller to the processor.
Yep.
And then, of course, if I am a big cloud, I might have a lot of suppliers myself that are also involved.
For sure.
Those are called sub-processors in that sense. And as a controller, you need to risk evaluate all processors and sub-processors in determined towards what type of data are you actually collecting and processing, and for what purpose. So first off, as a controller, you need to have a legal principle on why you collect the data. One such thing that's perfectly legal to collect data is, of course, we want to get paid. It's a contractual thing.
Yep.
You want a service or a product, and for that, they want to charge you an amount of money.
For sure.
And you want to pay with credit card.
Yeah.
These are all perfectly legal and valid points why you have. What's not okay then is if Amazon collects your credit card information and then uses that for market targeting purposes and sells that to other vendors who can send direct commercials to you or advertisements to you.
Yep.
That's not legal.
No.
That has to be stipulated otherwise. But you always need to find a legal principle and use the personal data, and you're only allowed to use personal data for that purpose alone. And the most important principle of all of this, because I see a lot of companies, and you see that with the enforcement tracker as well, on where they fail, is one, they don't understand that you need to have a legal purpose for processing data. You fail that. Or two, if they have a legal purpose, they say, but heck, we had a legal purpose for processing data. Yeah, but did you leak the data? Yes. And the first and foremost, before anything else in GDPR, when you start to collect data, the first and foremost thing you need to ask yourself is, can we keep it secure from data breaches? In no way, nowhere ever are you allowed to cause data breaches.
No.
You're not allowed to leak your data in any sense.
And that should be your first point of priority.
Do not leak data.
Don't leak data.
And if you're not up to snuff in your processes around leaking data, please fix that first.
Yes. And I just want to add that before you continue. I believe here's also one thing that I hear a lot is that you cannot outsource your data breach possibility. Meaning if you use a cloud provider or a infrastructure provider or some sort of partner that handles your infrastructure or your data or your applications or whatever, you cannot say it could be their fault, absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong, but it's still your responsibility to make sure before you hire them, how does their processes, what does they actually look like, what is their way of working, and so on and so forth. You can't outsource that problem from your own hands. You're still responsible for the data you collect for your service, regardless of how your processor and sub-processor structure look like. That is still in the responsibility of the controller. Because I hear that a lot, but it wasn't me, it wasn't us, it was someone else. Yeah, and that's fine. And then that means you can probably sue them if they have done it unlawfully.
But still, it's still you that have failed the GDPR provision.
Yes, you're part of that process still.
And please believe that you as a controller are always the major party responsible for all other processing, even if you contract a lot of processors or sub-processor in turn. You as the controller have the main responsibility because it was on your end that you started the collection.
Yes, that was
and
your initiative.
You made the decision. Because GDPR is very clear. There is nothing, absolutely nothing in the world forcing you to process any type of personal data at all.
No, that's up to you.
That's perfectly up to you. Of course, you can't run a business by not doing this.
No, it's going to be hard. Yeah, fair enough. That's going to be tough.
So, I mean, absolutely. But then you have to follow the laws. And I hear a lot of arguments that we shouldn't have a regulated market surrounding personal data.
For IT industries, no.
No, industries won't self-control and won't self-regulate. That's just the truth of it.
No.
Personal data is the new gold.
Yes.
Valued crazy amount of money. And that's why the reason. And if there's crazy amount of money in the works, you will absolutely not get a self-regulation.
No.
Look at pharmaceuticals. Look at banking. Look at insurance. I don't think anyone would, in a straight face, be able to argue we shouldn't have air traffic security anymore. We should allow the industries to self-regulate.
Yeah, for sure. Let's let the airports self-regulate their own controls. No. That's going to end up in a nightmare, because guess what? As long as there is monetary gain for someone, I mean, it only takes one, right? 10 of us can be completely in an agreement for how to work in a controlled manner, but there's one that decides to take up an opportunity and make money out of an unregulated business. And unfortunately, within the IT industry, it's been unregulated for far too long. And since everything almost today is internet connected in one way, shape, or form, the internet, unfortunately, today is pretty much unregulated as well. Well, you can argue that depending on country and so on and so forth. But in general, there are no real regulations for what's right or what's wrong. Hence where the data protection laws come into place. Problem now in that situation, of course, is that we don't have one law for the entire world. We have several laws which are not in direct, well, they are in conflict with each other. That's the problem also. But having a completely unregulated market, no. Let's just... Bitcoin, my goodness. How's that going for you?
Yeah. So, okay, back to the basics. A data subject, and you as a controller wants to collect information from the data subject just because you want to sell them something, they want to be able to pay something, and they want to collect delivery. Yep. Very natural stuff.
Yep.
Nothing strange about that. Then as I said, it's up to you as the controller to make sure that these information are kept safe, and you don't reuse it for a different purpose than the one you collected, because then it's illegal again. Yep. You need to find a legal purpose why you collect it for that issue.
For one reason.
Yes. So the next part is, of course, that as the controller, you are responsible for ensuring that all your processors also follow this law, and you don't lower security in any way or shape or form by using this type of processor.
Yep.
And that includes doing an evaluation of all their sub-processors to make sure that they don't, in turn, lower the standards, security standards that are put through GDPR. So this is also the biggest and trickiest question now with GDPR, because this means that you need to do a data protection impact assessment, it's called. You need to do a risk assessment and an analysis what happens if this data is breached. Yep. Should this data be breached? And have an appropriate risk assessment made by this. And here, things are really up for question. I highly recommend that you hire an expert when you do your risk assessment the first time, if you're not familiar in doing appropriate risk assessments. Because the biggest tricky question here is, of course, the risk assessment. There's no clear-cut, exact provisions. One risk assessment should look like this and nothing else, and it's always like this. No, you can't say that, because it's very, very different. Imagine if I collect data that's your hospital record, your patient journal. or if I collect data for a newsletter, that's your public-facing email address. That's very different information. And the same is true if I collect data that's your information that you share with your shrink and psychologist. It's a crazy different opinion than if I collect data that happens to be your home delivery address. So, different purposes, different consequences if they are breached, needs a different set of risk assessments. But of course, that's where it comes tricky, because since it's not clear cut in any sense, you need to leave a lot up to interpretation. And you need to leave a lot up to court rulings, because there's no way I can go and say to someone, you've made a poor risk assessment here. And say that's illegal. No, that needs to go through court.
Yeah.
I can say that not doing a risk assessment is illegal. That's very clear cut. That's a perfectly fine thing. I can say from the risk assessments, have they done it? I can of course argue that I think parts of it are missing. And they should have contracted a professional instead of trying to do it themselves, because most of the risk assessments are missing. That's one thing, but I can't say they're wrong in that sense, because that's very much up for the interpretation, and that's something court rulings will have to iron out in the long run. The sad part with this is they have certification mechanisms to help with this, but they have not implemented them. So to date, I still cannot buy any of those as a
no.
So yeah, so this is still a tricky issue, because 3 years later you might want to have implemented a few of these nice ideas you had about helping people. Anyway, here we are. But that said, certain things are set for absolute true, and you can't say, oh, those don't apply. Those we cannot negotiate. Sorry, no, you have to negotiate those. And certain things are up for interpretation, and it's exactly the risk assessment that can be up for interpretation. And of course, that's something each controller needs to do, and that's also something that's very tricky. So yeah, that's why we end up in these a bit crazy debates here and there about this. But yeah, remember a few principles and absolutely the definitions in GDPR. You cannot reinterpret the definitions. The definitions is definitions, so don't even try that one. I know big hyperscalers, called the muffins, are keen on reinterpreting the definitions in GDPR, but that's not true. That's not a possibility even. Sorry to say. And remember that processing data and being a processor is different things. So both a controller and a processor are processing data. This is crazy confusing for people, and I tend to agree that the naming is crazy confusing. But yeah, so whenever it comes to gathering personal data, there's always a data subject, or plenty of data subjects usually, and a controller. That's the baseline. A legal entity that gathers the information about a lot of living people. Those are the data subjects. That's always baseline, and then they might request a lot of subcontractors. Those are processors.
Yep.
So yeah, and the controller is the one mainly responsible for all this in GDPR. You of course have some obligations as a processor, but mostly you have to follow what the controller tells you to do. That's the biggest and most important of all this. So that's the issue. But all the obligations, all the legal requirements are on the controller. That's also important to remember. And controller needs to make a data protection impact assessment and have that on file. For every purpose they've tried to collect personal data, they need to have a data protection impact assessment. So it's one for a lot of different systems, I bet you. So start by cataloging your information assets. to see what type of information do we have there. For what purpose are we gathering this information in our systems? And do a security impact assessment and look at, can we keep this safe from data breaches first and foremost? And then when you have done this, we can come to parts that are actually up for debate. But nothing of this said so far is actually up for debate.
No.
And then we usually get into this, but if data is encrypted, yeah, okay. I try to compare them to like this. Imagine you have this small safety deposit box, as you have in your hotel room when you travel, for instance. You have this small locked box that you can. Imagine if you have a sheet of paper. That's a lot of personal data on.
Yep.
It might be anything, but for sake, let's say it's a list of kids in your school class that have allergies. You have kids with allergies. This is medical information, sensitive data.
For sure.
And you have this written on a piece of paper. Anyone who can see this piece of paper can, of course, read this. And you put this piece of paper into the safety deposit box. Then you have a organization, a company that you've contracted to move the safety deposit box out of the lunchroom and into a big security vault during the night to store it more securely, and then move it out to the room again. The firm that you contracted to move the safety deposit box is still a processor. It's still personal data, even if they can't directly connect to the personal data, even if it's locked away, so they can't read it directly. This is encryption. They can't read it directly, but they're still responsible for moving it. Then it's still processing of personal data. And then I recommend go back and read the definitions. There's nothing there that says encrypted data is taken apart. No. It's still processing, even if it contains. So even if you know that the encrypted data contains personal data, then it's still processing. It's of course a lot better from a data breach perspective. That you might be safer a lot if you encrypt data. So I usually hear sometimes the argument we shouldn't do any encryption at all because it's no use anyway regardless of GDPR. No. It's always a good security practice to encrypt data. However, it might lower and set less requirements on you in your risk assessment if you have encrypted data. That's one thing. But it still requires legal processing. Even if it's encrypted, you still are part of the processing of personal data. Encrypted or not, you're still part of the processing. So encryption does not take away the demand of GDPR.
No.
It can take away a bit of the severity if there is a data breach, but you're still part of the process. Because imagine if you take this safety deposit box and people say, destroy this personal data. One is opening it and putting fire to that document. Then it's destroyed, of course. But one is taking this entire box. No way I can read it, but I put it under a pile of explosives and blow it away. I've also destroyed that one. Without being able to see it. This is exactly what most processors are charged of doing, destroying the disk where we've stored the encrypted data.
Exactly.
That's the part. So you're still part of the processing of data, however, even if you can't be able to read it in clear text. That's part of it. So part of understanding a bit that, yes, and that means that you still need to abide by all 99 articles.
So let's agree on that. All articles, the entire law.
Are you a controller or are you a processor? You still need to abide by all 99 articles in the law. Unfortunately, if you're a processor, you only need to concern yourself about the 20 or so articles that concern you specifically. The rest is the controller's obligation to make sure.
Yeah.
But regardless, all 99 articles need to be followed.
All right. Let's stop there. And let's continue next week, because we've been ordered to talk more about this. Even though we actually don't really... I mean, it's fun, don't get us wrong, but there are more sexy topics to talk about, I guess, but it is relevant again, so...
Yeah, and I can give you a teaser next week. We will specifically talk about transfers of personal data to third countries again.
Yes,
we
again.
talked to it, but the nice part now, as I said, a lot of guiding things. EDPB has come out with stuff, court rulings has come out with stuff. But we are still not discussing the same thing. So let's talk specifically about everything about the transfers of personal data to third countries.
Yep.
And see, okay, please, you have to understand, because there's a lot of, let's say, propaganda answers. Answers deliberately to cause confusion. Because it's very much politician answers. If you know you fail on one article, when I ask you, please explain how you resolve Article 48. It's a lot more convenient to resolve. We resolve Article 45 this way. But that's not...
That's not answering the question.
That's not answering the question. But that's a very popular scenario we see more and more today. And especially, as we've mentioned, encryption. No. Still doesn't help. How do you resolve Article 48?
And we will go through what exactly Article 48 is,
Exactly.
Unless you haven't already read this law up and down, back and forwards, which you should have by now. But if you haven't, of course, we will explain what Article 48 is next week.
If you think all of this is crazy confusing, please know that you can get help from us directly.
For sure. Reach out. Because on the same place where you can reach us in terms of citynetwork.eu/podcast, you can also now reach out to us and say, we would like some assistance and help with this, and get the information security stack in your house to talk to you with your company and your peers directly. So that's an option starting 2022. So we look forward to hearing from you if you want our assistance in these matters, or at least maybe we can guide you to people who know what to do, in what order, in what fashion. So feel free to reach out. So next week, Article 48, data transfers to third country, all that lovely thing again. But we'll go through it again because it's important. So until then, have an awesome weekend, or week, depending on when you listen to this. Talk to you next time.